Hi David, great to have you here in Berlin as a fellow of the Cluster of Excellence 2020 Temporal Communities doing literature in a global perspective. Berlin is not new to you, and you have, among other things, curated Misfits pages from a loose-leaf modernity at Haus der Kultur in der Welt in 2017. For which a small but fine publication was published. And among your other curatorial projects and texts, I would like to specifically highlight your 2018's publication, Artist to Artist, Independent Art Festivals in Chiang Mai from 1992 to 1908. Which you have co-edited with David Morris, and you have numerous roles. You're a curator, you are a writer, you are an associate professor at the National University of Singapore, and among many other things, you're a loving husband and soon becoming the father of 2 childs. And in this specific video essay, I would like to concentrate on the role of the curator. And at first glance, the main differences between you and me is that I am currently a permanent curator at a museum, while you are a freelance curator. However, there are other differences that may not be so obvious and that are related to the specific regional or cultural settings in which we currently live. And I know we only have 15 minutes, but could you maybe talk a little bit about your experience as a curator in different parts of the world? How would you describe the changes in the history of curating?
This is a very interesting question, I think, because in fact, through this specific lens of what has happened to the curatorial role, I think the region makes sense in a way that it doesn't through other lenses sometimes. I think it's still a very diverse region. If you think about the kind of, let's say, infrastructural characteristics of this or that country around Southeast Asia anyway, it's a highly variable landscape. The role of the curator when I arrived, as I said, it was quite hard to discern kind of curatorial intelligence in the exhibition landscape, generally speaking. There were, of course, already by that stage, state institutions, particularly in Singapore, which had staked a claim to contemporary art. This was not the case in every country. Many of the national or state or municipal gallery spaces in the region were more or less allergic to contemporary art. And they were showing what seemed to me, anyway, to be a kind of late modernism, which was usually in one case or another associated with the academic institutions of that place. So it was a bit of a wasteland, it seemed, from this curatorial point of view. As I got to know people, of course, I found that there were many people working independently in very interesting ways. They tended to be less visible. They tended to be less well-resourced, of course. But it occurred to me as I learned more that actually these were the people that were making contemporary art history, and that the institutions in most parts of the region were really peripheral to the sort of contemporary game. If you fast forward to the present, it's a very, very different region. I think the curatorial function is much better utilised. Certainly there are many, many more people identifying themselves as curators. And
so when I arrived in the region for the first time, there were a lot of people who were rejecting to be called curator, and still there are some, right?
One could actually tell this history as a story of that rejection. And I think this is one of the reasons that I was drawn to the festival contexts of the 1990s in working to put together the publication that you mentioned, which is about Chiang Mai. In the 1990s, regionally, again, I think it's fair to say that generally contemporaneity, or something that would subsequently be very legible as contemporary art, I mean legible internationally as contemporary art, was being practiced and innovated in artist-run environments. There is a very, very long list of these spaces, groups, festivals, and other kinds of platform, sometimes publications. And I would say that in the 90s, this was, in a sense, the kind of germinal phase for what would later be established as Southeast Asian contemporary art, a kind of classifiable, collectible, exhibitable thing, which was contemporary and regional. Curators were to have an important role in that becoming, but I think it's fair to say as a generalization that most of the sites, or at least it seems to me, most of the sites where this activity was emerging considered the role of the curator and decided they didn't really want anything to do with it, at least in the early years of that. So we're talking about the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So it wouldn't have been a very good time to be a curator anyway, I think, because these autonomous or independent groups of artists, I think were in most cases very conscious of the arrival of curators from elsewhere. This is the period in which large transnational exhibition platforms were being set up, particularly in places like Brisbane in Australia and in Japan. Japan was certainly the kind of leading diplomatic force in the region when it comes to the fostering of contemporary activity. And curators were showing up in these places in Southeast Asia, but I think it's as a general rule, the role, there was some suspicion of the role. This was very much the case in Chiang Mai, the situation that I studied most closely, where there was a very explicit conversation amongst the organising artists, multiple consecutive years, about whether there should be a curatorial author of the festival, and the answer was always negative, and no such author was ever took that position. So I think this tells you something about where the sort of value of the curator could and could not emerge. It definitely had a place in larger institutional sort of organisational forms, but at the artist-run level, I think it took quite a while for that discussion to really take off in some cases. I don't consider myself a sort of primary user of archives at all. I have great admiration for art historians, but I don't think of myself as an art historian. The short answer is that artists' archives in the region produced by artists, and in some cases their families, their loved ones, their friends, their fellow artists. The situation where some larger organisation produces an important archive, and by archive I don't mean just collecting stuff together, I mean also giving it some order, perhaps even arranging it for accessibility for others. The number of cases where a large institution has done that are almost zero in the history of contemporary art in Southeast Asia. I mean, institutions have failed in that role. This is changing. Thankfully, this is changing. But to do research on the history of contemporary art in Southeast Asia, you will inevitably be working with materials that have been kept by artists and preserved by artists, and sometimes organised by artists, sometimes not organised, and really looked after as a labour of love. So this is a very important kind of warning or proviso for anyone interested in the subject, right? That you need a different set of skills. You can't go to a database and look up what you're looking for. You have to talk to people. There are many people who've observed this and written intelligently about this, who have thought about it much more than me. Someone like Nora Taylor, for example, has written quite extensively on this problem of the ethnographic component of art historical work in the region. And I think that's in some ways a positive lack, actually. One thing that happens when institutions get hold of archives is that they start to take on a certain kind of narrative. They start to be put in the service of institutional imperatives, one way or another, be they national or otherwise. And I think that's not always for the best. You know, I would like to see more art historical materials better preserved. Southeast Asia is a lousy place for keeping anything physical. But above all, I would like to see more art historical materials well disseminated. You know, there frankly isn't much trans-historical knowledge yet in the field. And if you think about the people who are now emerging as trained art historians, there is more of a regional awareness or a sort of cross-national understanding. There is a lot more transnational publishing of art historical knowledge, but most of the experts still, almost all of them, still stick to their national turf. This to me is not a great sign. I actually think that the national stories have either been told or will continue to be told anyway. I think what independent-minded scholars should be doing is looking for the moments where those national stories don't make sense, and looking for the individuals that are not part of those stories, and looking for the moments where national experiences or non-national experiences intersect in the regional landscape. And I think to some extent there's now a very established curatorial dialogue about that. I haven't seen that much of an art history yet that I would say is regional in that sense. I'm interested in the history of the curatorial role. If you try to tell that history within the frame of, let's say, global contemporary art, you're often led back to maybe Harald Seemann. You're led in a certain direction to this emergence of the non-institutional, right, that we've talked about earlier. The moment when the curatorial function is somehow freed from that sedentary experience of institutional life and maybe freed from the collection, is therefore able to think about the present in a new way and is able to work with materials from a very wide spread. That's all good and well, but that's not the experience of anywhere other than North America and Western Europe, actually. And actually, the majority of the world, of the art world, is made up of people outside of those places who have a completely different history of that role. So I started to think about, if we accept that the curator has been a pivotal figure in the emergence of contemporaneity, or the ideologically valued contemporary, if the curator is indeed an important figure in liberating that value in modern art, then maybe we need to tell more specific histories for the places where we're doing our research. And I'm not sure where that will be for me, whether it will continue to be Southeast Asia or whether it will be maybe a larger geography. I'm very interested in East Asia, and this interest led me to Okakura. In some respects, he's an obvious figure. He's a figure who worked internationally, was employed for many years at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston as the overseer of an Asian art collection. In some respects, he is the kind of archetypal, the first modern Asian curator. At the same time, I think he's a very complicated figure because of his involvement in the establishment of a nationally identifiable kind of art that was not really being championed as any kind of modernism, but was being championed as a kind of almost traditional, or at least neo-traditional kind of national aesthetic value. So this is very interesting. I think if you study the history of curating in Southeast Asia, take for example a book like Patrick Flores's Past Peripheral, you find that one thing that distinguishes the curator figure very distinctly in Southeast Asia is their tight relationship with national power, or with at least with the articulation of national form. This is not the case in the Swiss example, right? But this is very distinct to Asian contemporaneity, right? That the relationship with the modern state is very legible in curatorial work. So if we think about Okakura then as a kind of prototype figure in some ways, whose relationship to nation, even if that was somewhat retrospectively established, some of his work became a kind of rallying point for basically proto-fascist forces in the cultural bureaucracy of Japan leading up to the Second World War. It became celebrated by a very hard kind of nationalism, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's any less interesting, and in fact maybe quite the contrary. I think Europe probably, could also benefit from thinking again about this relationship between curatorial power and state power. And I think in Okakura's case, what captivated me is also this kind of what's the word? He's like an impresario in a way, not for individuals so much as for a kind of regional forms, regional styles, and a kind of narrative of Asianness. So this is how one would typically encounter Okakura in the written record as a theorist and exponent of Pan-Asian thought. And that indeed is also, I think, very interesting and timely and relevant at the present, where we're, I think, trying to reckon with histories of transnational cultural exchange in a more historically deep way. I think he's clearly somebody that we had to return to, but then at the same time I think his experience as a public intellectual makes him again a little bit strange here, that as an Asian man working as a curator across national borders, he didn't just want to build an important collection. He didn't just want to set straight the sort of the science of cultural, historicization or whatever. He wanted also a persona. He wanted a certain kind of fame. He published a lot in the English language. He was close with the West Bengal intellectual circles around the Tagore family. I mean, in some respects, he walked the walk of a contemporary kind of curator, in ways that I think a lot of the intervening years didn't show us. So I think he's interesting for many reasons.
Is this also the reason why you wouldn't consider yourself as in a classical sense, as an art historian?
There's multiple reasons for that. I did study in a department of art history and theory, but fairly soon in my studies I realized that I was more interested in the theory than the history. This is no longer really the case, but that's how I was sort of trained. I was trained in what in some places would be called comparative literature. It was mainly continental, mainly European theory. But when I got to Asia, of course, I realized that nobody had any use whatsoever for a critical theorist. And what they needed was something else. And one of those things is art history, actually. And so I guess you could say that in the last 10 years, my work has drifted back towards a more historicising sort of instinct. I do think it's incredibly important that the stories of modern art get told in a historically responsible and, if possible, in an independent way. Not necessarily independent of institutions, but independent of state imperatives, independent of, dominant patronage, and this is something that in many parts of the region we still don't have. So my work kind of has moved into that vacuum a little bit, I think. I'm happy to say that a lot more art historical work is now being done in the region, which is much more scholarly and I think much more responsible. But yeah, I also would say I didn't become an art historian because of a question of literary taste. It's also about my own inclinations. What do you want to spend your time reading and writing? And I have felt for a long time that the best literature about art is not really being produced by art historians, and so I really felt like if I was going to focus on contemporary art, that I wanted something else. And this, I suppose, is one of the reasons that I was also attracted to the curatorial position, because curating for me also involves writing, it also involves research, it also involves critique, and all of these things, make for better writing for me, and so I could see that practicing as a curator was also going to help me to write in a way perhaps closer to what I wanted. So tell me about your own curatorial position.
Well, just like an independent curator, I have conversations with artists and develop projects with artists, meeting curator colleagues like, for example, here Rein Wolfs or Eva Kraus. I discuss artworks. I'm talking with gallerists. Sometimes a curator tries to get an overview and has conversations with clouds. Sometimes curators try to find out where the grass is greenest. And sometimes a curator finds art at unexpected places, like this piece by Ulrich Rückriem near a cornfield. Sometimes a curator has conversations with limestone and ivy, pumpkins and cows, hydrangea, water, bees. I also conceive the exhibition architecture and speak with exhibition constructors and art handlers, and of course with conservators, develop the key visual with graphic designers. And especially when you're working as a curator for the Prussian Heritage Foundation, this means that you have to do a lot of paperwork, and this is why it's also so important to work in a team and not as a singular curator. Indeed, most of my curatorial practice is dedicated to working on international collaborative projects, specifically in curatorial teams, because in my opinion this is the only way to replace the apparent order of the world with the practice of permanent story making and to express the perspectives and words of many different actors. Like in 2018, as part of the large collaborative Nationalgalerie exhibition Hello World, where I worked with curators Grace Sambo and Enin Suprianto, and not pictured here, the artist Geda Mahendra Yaza, on an exhibition chapter titled Making Paradise, which revolved around the influence of colonialism on painting, music and dance in Bali and Bali's development as a tourist destination. Or in 2019, where I worked with Victor Wang, Yang Bai Chen and Pi Li on the exhibition Micro Era with works by Cao Fei, Fang Di, Lu Yang and Chang Pei Li, who are living in China. Last but not least, for the current research and exhibition project Collecting Entanglements and Embodied Histories, I've been working with Grace Sambo, Gratia Gavivon and June Jupp since 2017.